Thank you so much for joining us for CBN News Watch. I'm Efrem Graham. Ahead today, the impact on Israel of the surprising deal between Iran and Saudi Arabia.
The two Middle Eastern powers agreed to reestablish diplomatic relations and reopen embassies after 7 years of tensions. Why some say it should be a wake-up call for the Biden administration. And how Israel was caught off guard by the announcement. We'll bring you the story from Jerusalem. Here in the U.S., federal regulators extraordinary steps to stop a potential banking crisis after the historic failure of Silicon Valley Bank.
We are concerned about depositors and are focused on trying to meet their needs.
Why their action may have prevented runs on other banks. How China is building up its nuclear arsenal and getting help from Russia.
Russia is providing fuel for China's reactors that produce nuclear material, these reactors that produce plutonium. And plutonium is the important nuclear material that China needs for its nuclear buildup.
We'll look at China's moves to develop its stockpile of intercontinental nuclear missiles, which can hit the United States. And migrants from around the world, including China, Somalia, and Afghanistan, making the dangerous journey through Central America to the United States.
A lot of the people were dehydrated. We saw a lot of migrants dehydrated, so it was really bad.
Those stories for you today on CBN News Watch.
This is CBN News Watch.
I want to begin this half hour with the stunning agreement involving key players in the Middle East, Iran and Saudi Arabia, restoring diplomatic relations in a deal brokered by China. As Chris Mitchell reports, the bombshell announcement sent shockwaves throughout the region, including Jerusalem, all the way to Washington, D.C.
After more than a year of meetings and 4 days of negotiations in Beijing between Iran and Saudi Arabia, China said the three nations reached an agreement. The deal includes resumption of diplomatic relations, reopening their embassies within 2 months, and a commitment to respect each other's sovereignty, keeping out of their internal affairs. Many Middle East observers are concerned over China's role in brokering the deal.
The new and deeply concerning factor here is the Chinese role in all of this. To suddenly find, kind of as a surprise, that our new great power competitor, the primary threat to the American-led world order, China, was so central to this deal that involves not only our worst enemy in the Middle East, but bringing them together with one of our oldest Arab friends and allies and partners in the region, Saudi Arabia, is a new and worrisome development about China's own penetration and influence in this critical part of the world.
Jason Greenblatt, one of the architects of the Abraham Accords, says it reveals China's growing influence and America's waning power in the region. Should be a wake-up call to the Biden administration.
The United States essentially has ceded some important ground, an important area for U.S. stability and security, to China to some degree. That's not good for the United States. I think the United States ought to pay attention. I don't know if the Biden administration was caught flat-footed. It's hard to tell, but they ought to pay much closer attention now and work with the region, in particular Saudi Arabia, to be a part of it and not pivot away from it.
Hanna recently visited Saudi Arabia and met with its top leaders. He says Saudi is hedging its bets because its relationship with the U.S. is not as strong as it once was.
If the Saudis had their druthers, the relationship with the United States would be strong, secure. They'd have enormous trust and confidence in it. Unfortunately, that has all eroded drastically over the last 2 years. That was the message we heard when we were in Riyadh.
CBN News asked Greenblatt what this means for Israel.
But I think Israel needs to take a very, very close watch at this. Them too. I don't know if they were caught flat-footed here, but I think that rather than blaming within Israel whose fault this is, I think they need to look forward and figure out how do they protect Israel and how do they further integrate Israel into the security architecture of the Middle East.
Despite this deal, Greenblatt remains bullish on the Abraham Accords and believes it's still possible Saudi Arabia could join.
I am still very optimistic. As I mentioned, I travel there a lot, and with each passing trip, I'm just sort of amazed at what's happening on the ground in particular in Saudi Arabia. So I'm very, very optimistic. And I think we can look to the UAE to understand a country that has recognized a way to be close with Israel, develop strong ties with Israel, do significant business, and have security cooperation with Israel, while at the same time being realistic and understanding that Iran is also part of the region, and they can have ties with Iran while at the same time as having ties with Israel.
With the agreement just days old, many questions remain about its impact on the region, from the possibility of a military strike by Israel against Iran to the war in Yemen. Ephraim?
How will this agreement with Iran affect Saudi Arabia joining the Abraham Accord peace deals involving Israel?
Well, first of all, Ephraim, it necessarily doesn't eliminate the prospect of a relationship between Saudi Arabia and Israel and the Saudis joining the Abraham Accords. You would think that maybe on first blush, but to join the Accords, the Saudis want a relationship restored between themselves and the U.S. They actually made that clear last Thursday, just before this announcement on Friday. Now, the UAE is an example of what a Gulf nation can do. They can develop strong ties with Israel economically, even militarily, and yet they can still have diplomatic relations with Iran. So the Abraham Accords are not over. It's just not part of this conversation. We'll see if Benjamin Netanyahu, which was a goal of his, can try to get the Saudis into the Abraham Accords.
Why was the deal brokered in China? Have the Saudis lost trust in the United States because of the Biden administration?
Well, a couple of things, Ephraim. First of all, since, as we saw in our story, the U.S. has stepped away from the Middle East in many ways, and they've alienated Saudi Arabia. And sort of that's why China has stepped in. They've filled a vacuum that's left by the U.S., and it really is a wake-up call by the to the Biden administration to work with Saudi Arabia. What this agreement does in terms of geopolitics, it relieves the pressure on the Iranians and then having China usurp the historic role of the U.S. in the region. And this is something the U.S. had historically, and now China is getting in there. For the Saudis, they've really lost faith in the U.S. to be the security guarantor, as it has historically been. And what they're doing is simply taking care of their own interests. They're trying to protect and preserve their own future. And one more motivation, Ephraim, for Saudi Arabia is their pursuit of what they call Vision 2030. It's an initiative to transform the country from dependence on oil to one based on tourism and innovation. And for this to succeed, they really need calm between themselves and Iran.
How is this affecting the internal political climate inside Israel?
Well, the internal climate right here is pretty tense right now. And when this announcement came in, Yair Lapid, Naftali Bennett, Benny Gantz, all part of the former administration, they really condemned Netanyahu and the current government. Ironically, there's been no comment from the foreign ministry, and actually no comment by Prime Minister Netanyahu. Only a senior official commented, and that comment was the fact that these negotiations really had been going on for much of a year or more, part of the former government here in Israel. It does complicate things for Israel. Iran still supports the Houthis in Yemen, Hezbollah, Hamas, and will this agreement try to keep them quiet? It seems based on past history, the answer is probably no. When we talked to Jason Greenblatt, he said Israel needs to get beyond its own internal political rhetoric and find out how Israel can protect itself and be part of the regional security infrastructure.
How do you think this will impact the possible military strike on Iran's nuclear facilities?
Well, Ephraim, I think it really complicates things, but it doesn't put a veto over any Israeli plans to strike Iran's nuclear facilities, especially not only to Israel, but especially to Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. He said Israel reserves the right to strike Iran if it feels they need to stop Iran from getting a nuclear weapon that they could use it to destroy the Jewish state. He doesn't want the United States to have a veto over that. And so I think this agreement between Iran and Saudi Arabia, while it may complicate things, I don't think puts a veto on any plans by Israel to stop Iran's nuclear program if it feels it's an existential threat to the Jewish state.
All right. CBN News Middle East Bureau Chief Chris Mitchell reporting from Jerusalem. Chris, thank you so much. Here at home, the Treasury Department and bank regulators are assuring depositors of two failed banks that they will have access to their money today after taking extraordinary measures to stop a potential crisis following the failure of a major bank in California. Adil Hurd is on this story.
Banking regulators took action after damage from the second biggest bank failure in U.S. history began to create a panic and rippled around the world. After the failure of Silicon Valley Bank and then Signature Bank of New York, which invested in cryptocurrencies, regulators are now promising depositors they will have access to all their funds when branches open today.
I think that without this, there could have been some serious runs on other banks because there would have been a loss of confidence throughout the whole system.
The turmoil began last Wednesday when Silicon Valley Bank, a major lender in the troubled tech industry, tried to sell assets to boost its balance sheet after losing money in bond investments when the Fed raised interest rates. That panicked investors as customers raced to withdraw funds after seeing the news on social media. The Fed stepped in, tying up $150 billion in deposits and putting some banks and tech companies at risk. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen says the emergency measures put in place are not a bailout because the funds will come from an FDIC account, a pool of money paid into by U.S. banks.
We are concerned about depositors and are focused on trying to meet their needs.
And while depositors at the banks will be protected, stock and bond holders will not be. The crisis had already spread to Britain, where Silicon Valley Bank had a subsidiary. The UK Treasury and the Bank of England facilitated the sale of Silicon Valley Bank UK to HSBC and ensured the security of deposits. Dale Hurd, CBN News.
Let's say a crisis has been averted for now, and it's unlikely that another important bank will also suffer from major losses. But they add the economy is still facing concerns because the full impact of the Federal Reserve's increases in interest rates still hasn't yet hit, and we could still be facing a recession in the months ahead. Coming up, the growing threat from China and its building up its stockpile of nuclear missiles, which are capable of hitting the United States. Could China develop a bigger nuclear arsenal than America? We're going to take a look at that important question when we come back. The United States and South Korea militaries launched their biggest joint exercises in years today. Those drills coming after North Korea said today it has conducted submarine-launched cruise missile tests in an apparent protest of the exercises, which it views as a rehearsal for an invasion. North Korea's launches signaled the country likely will carry out provocative weapons testing. During the U.S.-South Korean drills, which are expected to last for 11 days, North Korea's increasing nuclear threats, along with concerns about China's ambitions, are pushing the United States to beef up its Asian alliances. And in fact, the Pentagon reports that China is adding to its nuclear arsenal and, with the help of Russia, could soon surpass the U.S. stockpile. National security correspondent Caitlin Burke is following this story, and she brings us the look at this question. Does the U.S. still hold a nuclear edge?
Newly unclassified information from the Pentagon makes clear that while China is quickly gaining, it has not yet surpassed U.S. nuclear capabilities. At the end of 2022, however, the communist power had amassed more intercontinental range missile launchers, or ICBMs.
So that means kind of the holes that they would be able to put long-range missiles in, capable of striking the U.S. homeland. And so this is just the latest step in China's buildup.
While many of China's ICBMs remain empty, their strategic partnership with Russia is a concern.
Russia is providing fuel for China's reactors that produce nuclear material, these reactors that produce plutonium. And plutonium is the important nuclear material that China needs for its nuclear buildup.
U.S. intelligence officials predict Beijing will soon be able to produce enough weapons-grade plutonium to increase its nuclear warhead stockpile as much as fourfold in the next 12 years. Those nuclear warheads would likely fill the now empty ICBMs. That kind of a buildup would also allow China to match the arsenals currently deployed by the U.S. and Russia.
China is refusing to sit down and negotiate with us. To me, that tells us that China is on an upwards trajectory, and it has no interest in negotiating or stalling its nuclear buildup.
Shortly after the Chinese spy balloon dust-up, President Xi Jinping pressed military leaders for an even faster elevation of his armed forces. Meanwhile, Russia backed out of a nuclear arms control treaty with the U.S., leading experts to urge the Pentagon to develop a new strategy.
We can't simply just try and try again for arms control if it's not working. We'll have to do everything we can to strengthen our own nuclear deterrent and make sure we're building the right capabilities that we need to deter Russia and China and make sure that they can't ever think that even as they build up their nuclear weapons that they can get away with using them.
The Heritage Foundation's Patty Jane Geller, a senior policy analyst for nuclear deterrence and missile defense, says U.S. capabilities have thus far stayed the same as Russia and China compete in an unofficial arms race to nuclear dominance.
The problem is the leaders in the arms race are Russia and China. The United States has not quite entered it yet.
Senior Pentagon officials say the U.S. is working to modernize all three legs of its land, sea, and air-based arsenals. The question remains whether the pace will be quick enough to keep our adversaries at bay. Caitlin Burke, CBN News, Washington.
Still ahead, coming to America, hundreds of thousands of migrants from countries around the world like China, Somalia, and Afghanistan are making the dangerous trip through Central America toward our southern border. Hear why it's being called a horrible journey and human torture right after this. A massive spike in the number of migrants heading to America from around the world. Nearly 250,000 men, women, and children from 150 countries traveled through the deadly region known as the Darien Gap in Panama last year. Even so, U.S. officials aren't trying to shut down the dangerous route. Instead, they're making changes that will bring even more people here illegally. Chuck Colton is bringing us the story.
Not long after sunup, on the steamy Panamanian side of the Darien Gap, dugout canoes make their way downriver to a tiny Indian village. The dugouts aren't carrying locals, however. They're packed with migrants from all over the world whose destination is the U.S. southern border. Recent policy changes by the Biden administration allow 120,000 migrants per month to skip this challenging trek by pre-registering using a new mobile app. Even so, Homeland Security Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas maintains the goal is not to stop migrants from entering the U.S.
What we're trying to do is, and more broadly, incentivize a safe and orderly way and cut out the smuggling organizations. And I've seen the criticism of it as a ban, but it is not a ban at all.
Since the new policy only covers Cuba, Haiti, Nicaragua, and Venezuela, migrants from other countries now fill these routes.
The migrants that are coming into Puerto Limon here are the lucky ones. They're the ones that had a little more money and were able to take the shorter route through the jungle that only took 3 or 4 days instead of 6 days or more. These tend to be more from places outside the Western Hemisphere, places like China, Afghanistan, India, places like that. We're going to go down and talk to some right now.
Many Chinese people said they decided to come now because of their country's harsh zero-COVID policy.
Somalia?
Mauritania.
Mauritania. Wow. Yeah. Somalia? Wow. Among those arriving at Puerto Limon this day included 2 American journalists, Ben Berquam and Oscar Ramirez. They'd just followed the migrant trail all the way from Colombia, walking 3.5 days through the jungle.
As we're heading out, we see the same group stuck here, waiting to figure out what to do.
Ask them what happened to their guide.
¿Qué les pasó con el guía?
It was way harder than what I thought that it was going to be. On the first day, it was really hard. We got a little bit lost right there in the second day, so we had a bad track. That was double the effort. And on the third day, we were exhausted. A lot of the people were dehydrated. We saw a lot of migrants dehydrated, so it was really bad.
He's not exaggerating. Yet Colombian smugglers are using videos like these to advertise in China, making the trek seem like a fun and easy hike in the woods. Chinese pay smugglers up to $20,000 per person, although the true cost is measured in misery.
It is completely destroying the environment. It is risking their lives. It is risking child's lives. It's human torture, what they're doing, and they're abusing people. That is the most shocking thing for me, that they put a human being through that, and they're promoting that. It's really false advertisement, what they're doing.
Second Lieutenant Vicente Guerra and his team of Senafront Border Police regularly recover bodies of those who die of heat stroke or drown during river crossings.
The dangers these migrants face are enormous because they have no experience surviving in the jungle. Others bring children through this. It's a whole different level of risk they are taking. We carry everything we need in case we have to spend the night in the jungle. These people have nothing.
On this trip, the Senafront team accompanied Ben and Oscar on their journey, making careful notes and keeping an eye out for the bandits known to prey on migrants. After experiencing it for themselves, the journalists had a clear message.
People should look for another routes for people to migrate, or a safe way or a safe pathway for people to go through another place if they want to migrate. But the Darien, no.
Don't come. Don't put your kids through this. Don't put yourself through this. Don't be raped. Don't be robbed. Don't be murdered by the cartels.
From Panama, I'm Chuck Holton for CBN News.
And we're right back with an encouraging word to jumpstart your week. Stay with us. Welcome back to CBN News Watch. Time now for your Monday motivation. And I offer this thought for you to begin your week. God isn't asking you to understand all things. He is asking you to trust Him in all things. His track record speaks for itself. He's trustworthy, and He's worthy of your trust, even in moments that you can't trace His hands or understand His plans. With that word, make this a marvelous Monday. Well, that is going to do it for this edition of CBN News Watch. I want to remind you can find more of our news programs on the CBN News channel at any time, as well as online. That address is cbnnews.com. We'd love to know what you think about the stories you've seen here today or any day. You can email us, newswatch@cbn.com. That address right there at the bottom of your screen. And of course, you can always reach out and touch us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. We would love to hear from you. Make this a marvelous Monday. We'll see you back here same time tomorrow. Bye-bye.